Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I wanted to do a bit of a breakdown for the new build that I'm playing in the Second Wind Private League. And if you don't know what that is, it's a brand new private league with a fresh economy reset. It started a couple of days back, and I will link all of the information for that in the pinned comment below. Now this build that I'm playing is once again another Titan. I just like this Ascendancy a little bit too much, but instead of Bear this time it's Wyvern, and this build is all focused around the Rend ability, which is like a sweep that goes across the Wyvern like that. It's a strike skill, but it also has a big area of effect component, and that's why I kind of wanted to play a Titan, because that's the whole idea of this build initially, was to scale area of effect like crazy, to have this giant kind of almost like a window wiper on a car that just kind of goes across the front of the Wyvern and just deletes everything, and that's exactly how it's turned out, which is pretty good. And this is the basic attack ability for the Wyvern. So to actually access this ability, you don't need to use a skill gem, you need to get it from the weapon itself, and you need to select Wyvern form on the weapon, and then you'll actually be able to use that attack with the weapon that you choose that form on. So Rend is a strike skill. As I said, it deals pretty good damage. This is a 327% attack damage at level 19 right now. I'm actually level 89 right now, so I'm about to hit that level 90, at which point I'll be unlocking the 6th socket here. We'll discuss sockets in a moment, but first let's just discuss how Rend works. So when this skill actually can consume a power charge, it will do just that upon use, and then you'll gain a buff for 10 seconds, and the buff will grant you 50% of damage gained as extra lightning. And that buff is global. It works for any other skills that you're using, but in this build we're using Rend as our main ability, so that means that we just kind of gain the buff, and once we actually have the buff, you then use the lightning charged version of Rend. So the lightning charged variant has quite a bit more damage. You can see there 554% attack damage compared to the 327% base. But then you get this kind of change in the way the ability works. You get 20% less attack speed and 150% more area of effect. So this is kind of a bit of a trade-off in terms of, clearing versus single target. This is quite a bit worse for single target, where, you're basically having a 20% less attack speed multiplier there, which is quite bad. But then for a clearing perspective, this 150% more area of effect is ridiculous. This is one of the only more area effect modifiers in the game. They're really, really rare. So getting this on an ability and this much of it is quite strong. What this means is this is a multiplier on the area of effect. So all of the area effect scaling we have for attacks on the tree, which you're going to see in a moment, is quite a lot. That gets then multiplied by this modifier, and you'll actually be able to see in the footage there that once this ability is charged up with that lightning charged buff, it kind of just has a gigantic area effect. And this was kind of the general idea of this build, was to utilize the Titan Ascendancy, which is a class that is able to get kind of more of anything from the tree than any other class in the game due to hulking form. And one of the main uses for hulking form is actually getting a lot more area of effect than any other class. So you can see that all of these small nodes here that grant, increased area effect, like these ones here, these grant 6% increased area effect there instead of 4%. And then these ones here grant the same, 6% increased area effect. We've got even more of it up here, 9% increased on these ones, and then there's more here, 9% increased. You can see we've got tons of area effect scaling all over the tree, and there's even more down here that we're going to be going for as we level up the build a bit more. And that leads to the ability just having this giant coverage. Now the other half of the build is what you can see in the title there, which is the triple elemental component, which is something that I've kind of reached at the build by this point. It wasn't initially in the plan, but I kind of ended up getting here by utilizing some different tech here and there to actually get to it. So I've already discussed the Rend ability, which, has that base extra lightning damage gained from consuming a power charge. That's the lightning component. That's where the extra lightning damage comes in, and that's quite a lot, right? That's 50%. But the other damage is coming in there first. The fire component comes in from Infernal Cry. Now, this is some pretty cool tech that I'm using here in terms of Warcries. I used some really cool tech in the last build, in the Bear build, to gain a bunch of rage. This one is doing something similar, but I wanted to solve a very specific problem that comes about when you're using an ability like Rend, and you're trying to empower it with a Warcry. That is that usually you have very fast attack speed, and therefore you kind of consume all of the empowerment really quickly before the cooldown is up, or it means you end up having to, spam the Warcry a bit too much. And so we're using some tech with this. First of all, we're using it in Ferocious Roar. The reason for that is that we gain a bunch of extra bonuses, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But in terms of Infernal Cry actually empowering the skill, usually when you use this ability, it will grant 1 empowerment per 10 enemy power in range, counting up to 50 power. So, if you do this next to a boss, you're going to be gaining a few empowerments there. But if you do this just normally, out of range of any monsters, you're not going to gain anything. So if you look on the passive tree, there's a node here, which is on our second weapon set. It's called Roaring Cries. That grants a minimum of 10 power. And that means that this Warcry will guarantee 1 empowerment when it actually gets used. And that means that we're going to gain that, 55% of damage as extra fire for 1 single attack. That, that's great, but it's immediately gone. So we want to find out a way to actually gain enough empowerments that we don't have to constantly spam this Warcry or, wait for its cooldown and things like that. So to do that, we're using Tireless, which makes it so we have 25% chance to not count the attack. So, 1 in every 4 times, you'll gain the empowerment without actually spending a charge on the Warcry. Then the tech begins here with Echoing Cry. Now, Echoing Cry says that you can kind of use this skill once and then it repeats the skill twice afterwards. So supported skills echo 2 times with a 1.3 second delay, but you can only use the skill after you've moved 10 meters. So you can see here, Ferocious Roar, I've moved a little bit so I'm able to use it. And then when I actually do use it, you can see I immediately have, look how many empowerments I have, right? So 9 empowerments. So at least empower 9 attacks. It will probably be a lot more than that because of Tireless. This skill basically means that we're able to gain a bunch of extra empowerments from only a single use of the Warcry. But part of that also comes from the passive tree once again. So this is this node right here, Vocal Empowerment, which says Warcries empower an additional attack. Now that means that every time we use Ferocious Roar to trigger Infernal Cry, what happens is the first use gives us those 2 guaranteed empowerments, and then each echo after that also gives us 2 guaranteed, for a total of a minimum of 6 empowered attacks, right? But then you'll notice the first time we used it, we had 9 empowered attacks, and that's because we have another node over here on the passive tree, which is Inherited Strength. So Warcries have a 15% chance to empower 3 additional attacks. And that is every single time it goes off, not just the initial use, but each echo as well has a chance to empower 3 additional attacks. So by using this tech, we're basically able to ensure that we can just run around and attack things without having to use our Warcry all that much, and we can, just use our skills like this, and you can see how many attacks this is able to empower right before I need to actually use the Warcry again. Look how many attacks that lasted. That was probably about 15 attacks or something like that. So that is some really, really nice tech. And on top of that, we also have Raging Cry there. Now, before we actually talk about Raging Cry, let's get back to the fact that this is Ferocious Roar and not Infernal Cry. So Ferocious Roar triggers the socketed Warcry. If you socket a human Warcry in there, which Infernal Cry is, it will trigger that Warcry, and that's why it costs so much mana. You can see here when I use it, it costs a huge amount of mana. That's because it's the mana cost of Ferocious Roar, which is 129 at the moment for me, and then also Infernal Cry, which is 244. So that is a lot of mana. You have to spend both of those at once because you're using Ferocious Roar and you're also triggering Infernal Cry. And what happens when you actually trigger this is you don't gain any of those first bonuses that you can see there on Ferocious Roar, but you actually gain the socketed Warcry bonuses. So you gain a bit of extra damage for the Warcry and extra area of effect. We don't really care about either of those things there. But what we do care about is attacks empowered by socketed skills deal 78% increased damage, and then another 30% from the quality there. So every single empowered attack, which is every attack we use, is 108% increased damage, on top of the extra damage as fire that's coming from Infernal Cry itself. So that's a huge boost in damage, but there's another bit of tech going on here with Ferocious Roar, because every time we use Ferocious Roar, we are also triggering Infernal Cry, and that means that Raging Cry actually counts both of those Warcries as a Warcry usage to grant Rage. And you can actually see that when I use the Warcry right here. We have a minimum of 10 power guaranteed, which means that usually by using a Warcry we would be gaining 8 Rage. But when we use the Warcry, we'll gain 16 Rage. There you go, you can see 16 Rage, and then the Echo gains another 16, and the final Echo would also gain another 16. As of right now, I don't have any maximum rage scaling in this build, but that's something that I intend to add in the near future when I level up. So we have the extra lightning damage coming in from Rend, and the extra fire damage from Infernal Cry. Then we have the extra cold damage, and that of course comes from Bhatair's Vengeance, which is a lineage support gem. This is a strong one that a lot of builds have been using in this patch, And this one basically grants you extra damage as cold based on your rage that you have when you actually gain the buff, and you gain the buff by freezing a target with the ability that it's socketed into. So we're using Lunar Assault, which is a strike skill, it's a werewolf attack, and this one converts a bit of your physical damage into cold, but more importantly, it has a massive more freeze build-up multiplier, 492% on this level 19 gem right here. And the crazy thing about this gem in this build is that it works incredibly well because we have so much extra damage from other sources, right? We have 50% of damage being gained as extra lightning, and then we have another 55% as extra fire from the Warcry. And all of that damage is gained as cold for this skill specifically because of Embitter. So that means we're able to really easily freeze with this. You'll actually be able to see that in the footage. Literally every time we use this skill, we just freeze anything that's in front of us. And that means that we can always keep this buff up. And it's also really nice defensively. For example, when I'm doing an abyss or something like that, just as the monsters are flying out of the abyss, I can just use this ability. It's ridiculously fast. It just sweeps across the screen and freezes everything as they're coming out of the abyss. And it's just really, really nice. This is a very strong ability in this build. And that is a little bit more extra cold damage coming in there. That would be 30% of damage as extra cold because we currently have 30 maximum rage. But as I said, as I kind of scale up and get more rage, that's going to be even more damage. And the last bit of extra damage is more extra cold, and that comes in from freezing Mark. So this is kind of the bit of tech that we're using to be able to freeze bosses a little bit easier. And whenever I'm kind of starting onto a boss, like a map boss, I'm going to use Pounce immediately at the start of that fight. That means that I can apply a freezing Mark there. And then, of course, I'm able to get my, buff from Rend by spending a power charge. And I'm already going to have Infernal Cry empowerments up at that point. And I can just spam Lunar Assault 2 or 3 times, and that boss is going to immediately be frozen. And that means that I'm able to keep up that extra cold damage buff from Bhatair's Vengeance. But I also gain another cold damage buff from Freezing Mark, which is another 30% of damage gained as extra cold. And I also have another 8% of damage gained as extra cold here on the passive tree. And that means that in total, with all of those buffs and empowerments and things like that, I have a total 173% of damage gained as extra elemental, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. And that's going to get even higher as I level up my gems. I can get more levels here on Infernal Cry. I can get more maximum rage for the Bhatair's Vengeance buff. So that's going to get quite a bit higher as I kind of level up and progress the build a bit further. But that is the kind of 2 components of the build. On one side, I'm trying to stack a lot of area effects to make Rend kind of ridiculous and cover the entire screen. On the other side, I've got this kind of triple element thing going on. And now let's kind of move into the charges of the build, because this build does rely on power charges specifically to gain the Rend buff. And without power charges, Rend is just kind of ridiculously small. You can see how small the area effect is there. It's really not very good. And so we need good power charge generation. Now, initially, I was using Devour right here, and I still do have Devour kind of on the bar because it's a very useful skill to have when you're moving like between packs. You can just use this if you want to. And especially if you're like backtracking to get to somewhere and there's a bit of a longer distance, you can use this on some, corpses on the ground after you've moved over those areas. And this is just going to grant you some power charges, and you also get a bit of healing there. This is basically a way, as I said, to gain power charges kind of out of combat when you're moving between areas. But the main way that I'm gaining power charges is Vol's Protector, which is a body armor there that grants a chance to gain a power charge on critical hit. And we're scaling crit a little bit in this build, not too much. We currently have a 40% main hand critical hit chance on this build. That's with an 11% base crit weapon, so we don't have a huge amount of crit scaling coming in. I can actually show you on the passive tree how much crit we have. We have this wheel right here for quite a bit of crit chance. Obviously, we're benefiting quite a bit from the Titan's hulking form on these nodes as well. And then we have some crit scaling coming in here from this notable and also this small node. And then over here, we've got a little bit more crit here, for a bit of crit chance. And I have some on my jewels as well. And I also am anointing critical exploit there for a bit more. So that means we've got around a 40% chance to crit whenever we're using Rend. And that means that the ability is kind of self-sustaining its own power charges there, because we're able to just hit and gain power charges with that skill and immediately spend them. And the way this ability works is that it won't spend a power charge if you already have the buff. And that is actually quite important because we're also using power charges for charge regulation. And this one gives you a 25% more critical hit chance while you have a power charge, but it also spends one of each charge every 10 seconds. So this is another consumer for a charge, and by boosting up our critical hit chance there, we're able to gain even more power charges. And because I was using charge regulation, I then wanted to use Combat Frenzy, which is another ability that I'm using there. Because I'm freezing a lot of monsters, that means I can gain frenzy charges, and I can also occasionally gain a bit of an extra charge coming in there. Maybe it's an endurance charge, so I can gain, a bit of extra defense there. But what it means is usually I'm going to have frenzy charges up to benefit from that extra increased skill speed there from charge regulation. Now let's quickly go over the gems that I've got here in the build, and then I'll go over my gear, and I'll go over the passive tree and Ascendancy. So for Rend, I will say there are not that many good support gems in the game for Rend for this specific build, but I'm kind of making use of what I've got. There is one really good support gem that I'll mention in just a moment, but let's just go through what I'm using first. So I'm using Rapid Attacks 2 for some increased attack speed, Elemental Armament as most of our damage is elemental. Then we have Execute 2 for a bit more damage there once the target reaches low life. And then we also have Rage 3, which is granting us Rage on hit, and we also get a bit of increased attack speed while we're not on maximum Rage. This is basically a throwaway gem. This could probably be close combat, but I rarely am ever in range to actually benefit from close combat. And there's not a huge amount of other options there for different gems. One gem that would be really good in this particular skill for this build would be Garrokan's Resolve, which is a very rare gem. It actually only drops from one of those special maps on the Atlas. And this one says maximum critical hit chance with supported skills is 50%, which is pretty much exactly where I'm at whenever I've got that power charge buff from charge regulation. I'm pretty much at 50% critical hit chance, so this wouldn't affect me at all. So I would gain the second line there, which is attack critical hit chance with supported skills by Furicase. And what that does is, it means that your critical hit chance is basically rolled twice, somewhat similar to Lucky, and if either of the crit rolls is successful, the attack is a crit, and, it deals normal bonus damage. But if both rolls are successful, it deals double critical damage bonus. So that is a very, very strong support gem that I could use there, but right now, this costs something like 23 divines in this league, and I think I only have like 5 divines right now, so a bit out of reach right now, but this is definitely something that I'll be looking at trying to get into the build, because that's a really, really good support gem. Now in terms of the other skills there, I have Purity of Ice. That is coming in from a scepter that I'm using. This is a pretty garbage scepter that I just kind of threw on about 15 levels ago or something, so this one is not really, very good for this build right now, but it's basically just the Purity of Ice aura, which grants me cold resistance, and then there's also some bonus stats there, like, extra spirit, some intelligence, some mana, that sort of stuff. The main thing about this is the reason I'm using the scepter there is because I have Lord of the Wilds. Usually you can't actually equip a scepter alongside Talisman, but this keystone allows you to do it. But there's a big trade-off there, which is the 50% less spirit, and also non-minion skills have 50% less reservation efficiency. But the reason why you use this is because there is currently this thing in-game, we don't know whether it's a bug or not, but basically all of these support gems here, which are all persistent buff support gems, so, Vitality 2, this costs 40 spirit, this one's 20 spirit, this is 30, and this is another 20. All of these are completely free, right, because they're in Purity of Ice. For some reason, that's the thing, it's been in the game a long time, but that's what I'm using in this build right now. And if this wasn't a thing, I probably wouldn't be using the whole, scepter tech, because I could benefit from other spirit skills elsewhere, but I'm currently using this. And then I have Devour, as I said, that is being used as a little bit of a way to gain power charges there out of combat. That has Rapid Attacks 3, Gorge, Charge Profusion 2, and Efficiency 2. Then there's Lunar Assault for that freezing setup with Bhatair's Vengeance, Embitter, Freeze, and Cold Attunement. Then we have Ferocious Roar with Infernal Cry, Tireless, Echoing Cry, and Raging Cry. Then there's Pounce with Freezing Mark, Mark for Death 2, Mark of Siphoning 2, and Rapid Attacks 3. And then we have Charge Regulation, which I discussed earlier. That's linked to Cool Headed. I had a bit of extra space from some extra spirit, so that's just a bit of less Ignite duration on me, because Ignite for some reason is dealing ridiculous damage this patch. Then there's Savage Fury, which is on Weapon Set 2. That one grants a buff whenever we want to use it for some more damage. That's linked to Prolonged Duration. And then Combat Frenzy, as I discussed earlier, linked to Charge Profusion 2. Now, in terms of the gear, I already discussed the Vol's Protector. The other stuff is basic life and resistance gear. I've tried to prioritize some sort of, extra energy shield coming in from the pieces, but there's not really that much there. You can see I have like 1300 energy shield right now, 2200 life, so not too bad, but not the best. And this build isn't particularly tanky, and that is something I kind of want to, gravitate towards, getting better gear so I can get a lot more energy shield into the build. But the main thing there is the weapon. Which I was actually very fortunate to get this quite cheap on trade. I think I paid 1 divine for it on day 1, possibly. It might have been day 1 or maybe the start of day 2. And this weapon is pretty much ideal for this build. The only thing that would basically be a little bit more ideal is if the added fire damage was cold instead. I would say the perfect weapon would probably be on this base, because this is a crit base, which is really good for this build. But the ideal weapon would probably be Tier 1 physical damage, Tier 1 flat physical, and then also Tier 1% increased physical, and then, Tier 1 added lightning would probably be the ideal prefixes. But this one is a lot of damage, along with the attack speed modifier. This is like an 800 DPS talisman, so it's pretty strong. And I have the attack speed modifier there, which came from a desecration, and then also the onslaught modifier from an essence, and I still need to use the perfect essence of battle. I'm kind of waiting a little bit with that because I'd like to have a bit more stock of, essence of battle and perfect essence of haste and things like that, because there's the chance there that it goes wrong. I basically need to hit a 1 in 3 for the perfect essence of battle to remove the stun duration modifier, and if that doesn't happen, I then kind of have to, go back and repeat the other steps. And then on the passive tree, first I'll just discuss the Ascendancy. So right now I'm still missing my Uber lab. I'm currently level 89, I think. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. I'm about to get to 90. So I'll be doing the Uber lab anytime soon. And the last point for the Ascendancy is going to be Mysterious Lineage, because I don't really gain much from the Stone Skin modifier there, because I don't have a huge amount of armor coming in from Bol's Devotion. And the other nodes are all slam based, so they don't affect Rend. And that means that the only other thing that I can benefit from on this Ascendancy is Mysterious Lineage, which is 15% more life, so that's going to be a nice defensive boost. But that's definitely the least important thing on this build, so that's why I've left it till last. We do have Hulking Form, of course, which I discussed earlier. Grab these two for the first 2 Ascensions, because Hulking Form is just a massive power spike. And then there's Crushing Impacts, which is 25% more damage against heavily stunned enemies, and your hits are crushing blows, so you basically get to immediately move to a heavy stun once you get primed for stun. And this build is actually able to disable enemies constantly. Like, I can immediately freeze bosses, as I mentioned earlier, and then after the freeze I'm able to heavy stun, so it's just kind of chain disable, and that's really, really strong. And in terms of the passive tree, earlier on I went for these melee damage nodes right out of the start, but I respec'd them into this because you save a point and the stun build up is pretty nice. And we just have, melee damage. The first weapon set, which is the weapon set we're using to actually use Rend, is spec'd with all of these nodes here for, damage and extra area effects and things like that. And then the second weapon set is spec'd for all of the Warcry stuff, as I mentioned earlier. And there's also a bit of extra skill effect duration here, which benefits the Savage Fury buff there that comes out. And it also benefits the Mark, because our Mark skill and Pounce is used by our second weapon set. And then over here, we're actually, gaining some increased armor and energy shield here. We have another wheel coming in here. And we have this wheel right here. This one I actually didn't mention. This is Warcries inflict 3 critical weakness on enemies. This is something I should have mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Warcry tech. This actually applies to each echoed Warcry as well. So, you're going to be gaining 9 stacks of critical weakness coming in from that, which is quite nice. Bit of extra crit chance. And we have some, extra damage and things like that up here. One other thing that I didn't mention, which I should have mentioned, is Tribal Fury. This is actually really important, so I should have mentioned it earlier. This strike skills deal splash damage. So Rend is an area of effect ability. It kind of hits everything in front of you, right? This is actually a strike skill, though. And every enemy that gets hit by this strike skill is also going to have, like, a splash. That's why when I'm clearing, like, Abyss or, Ritual or something like that, or even Breach, when there's, like, a decent amount of density of monsters, they just take this massive amount of cleave damage, right? Because every single hit kind of creates a splash, and that splash kind of overlaps on all of those targets. That is dealing a lot of bonus damage. But that's going to be about it for this video. I wanted to go over this build because I think it's quite cool. And I have put together a Mobalytics kind of build guide thing on the site. I'll link that in the description below and in the pinned comment. And I'll probably be updating that a little bit as I progress in this league. I'm not going to go too fast in this league. I kind of want to chill out a little bit because I'm still a bit burnt out from the initial league start. And this private league did start, you know, quite soon after that. But there you have it. The triple elemental Rend Titan. Pretty fun build. Thanks for watching this video. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.